Belgium in the early 1980s was not prepared for fear. This was a country that believed violence belonged elsewhere, to headlines from distant nations, to history books, to wars already finished. Belgium was orderly, predictable, small, a place where crime happened quietly, if at all, and justice arrived promptly behind it. That illusion would not survive the decade. What would come to be known as the Brabant Killers did not announce themselves with ideology or demands. There was no manifesto, no warning, no clear objective. They did not seek fame, ransom, or recognition. They did not explain themselves. They simply arrived. And when they did, people died. The first attacks did not look extraordinary. In March 1982, a small grocery store was robbed in the town of Maubeuge, just across the Belgian border in France. A man was shot dead during the robbery. It was violent, yes, but armed robberies sometimes are. Police logged it, filed it, and moved on. Then another robbery followed, then another. Each incident felt isolated, petty, criminal, but not exceptional, until patterns began to form. Witnesses described the same unsettling details again and again. Men wearing masks, men moving with military precision, men who showed no hesitation when firing weapons, men who appeared indifferent to money, but eager to use violence. And most disturbing of all, they often killed for no apparent reason. Victims who complied were shot anyway. Customers who froze were executed where they stood. Children were not spared. This was not robbery as a means to survival. This was robbery as an excuse. Belgian police at first treated the cases as unrelated. Different jurisdictions, different victims, different circumstances. But something about the brutality nagged at investigators. These were not panicked criminals. They were calm, deliberate, almost rehearsed. In the early attacks, the stolen amounts were laughably small, sometimes only a few $100s. Certainly not enough to justify the level of violence deployed. That contradiction would haunt the investigation for decades. If money wasn't the goal, then what was? By late 1982, the violence escalated. Gunmen stormed into shops during peak hours, firing indiscriminately. They used heavy caliber weapons more commonly associated with military or paramilitary units than street criminals. Witnesses recalled the sound, not the sharp crack of a handgun, but the deep, thunderous roar of automatic fire. One survivor later said it felt like a battlefield had materialized inside a supermarket. The killers were methodical. One man would control the entrance, another would fire, a third would watch, waiting for threats that never came. They moved as a unit, not a gang, a team. Fear began to spread. People altered routines. Parents avoided stores with their children. Shop owners closed early. Some installed barricades and panic rooms. Still, the attacks continued. And with each one, the killers seemed to grow bolder. By 1983, the media began to notice that something was wrong. The violence was too random, the cruelty too consistent, the lack of motive too glaring. Headlines grew darker. Supermarket massacre. Gunmen kill for pennies. Who are the Brabant Killers? The name stuck. What terrified the public was not just the killings. It was the absence of explanation. There were no demands, no statements, no clues left behind. The killers did not taunt police. They ignored them. Eyewitness descriptions conflicted wildly. Some swore the attackers were giants, over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, imposing. Others recalled shorter men, agile and fast. Faces were hidden, voices muffled, identities erased. It was as if the killers wanted to be seen, but never known. Ballistics linked multiple attacks to the same weapons, The same guns appeared again and again across crime scenes miles apart. The implication was chilling. This was not copycat violence. This was continuity. Belgian authorities assembled task forces. Files piled up. Suspects were questioned and released. Tips flooded in. Nothing stuck. No arrests. No trials. No answers. As the years passed, the violence did not fade. It evolved. The attacks grew more theatrical, more lethal. In one infamous incident, gunmen opened fire inside a crowded supermarket, killing entire families. Survivors described stepping over bodies, while gunfire echoed through aisles stacked with everyday goods: bread, milk, children's cereal. Ordinary life shattered in seconds. The killers showed no remorse. They did not flee quickly. They did not rush. Witnesses reported them walking calmly back to their vehicles, weapons still raised, as if daring anyone to stop them. No one did. The brutality began to feel intentional, not incidental, almost as if the violence itself was the message. But what was being communicated, and to whom? Police theories multiplied. Organized crime, extremist groups, foreign mercenaries, domestic terrorists, corrupt officials, secret services. Every theory raised new questions. Every question led nowhere. The killers left behind bodies, shell casings, and terror, but no fingerprints, no identities, no clear motive. And that, perhaps, was the most frightening part. They were not ghosts. They were real men, walking freely, planning their next move. By the mid-1980s, Belgium was no longer calm. It was waiting for the next attack, waiting for the next name added to the list, waiting for a knock that might never come. And still, the killers were not finished, not even close. By 1983, fear in Belgium had stopped being abstract. It had a shape, a sound, a rhythm. It arrived in the late afternoon when families shopped for dinner. It arrived with the screech of tires, the crash of doors, and the unmistakable thunder of gunfire echoing through fluorescent-lit aisles. The Brabant Killers had found their stage, and they used it mercilessly. The Delhaize supermarkets became symbols of terror. These were not hidden locations. They were open, bright, ordinary places. The kind of spaces people trusted. Parents brought children. Elderly couples walked slowly through aisles. Teenagers stocked shelves, thinking about nothing more than their shift ending. The killers exploited that trust. They didn't strike at night. They didn't choose isolated targets. They came when the stores were full. Survivors would later describe the same pattern again and again. A car screeching to a stop. Men jumping out, already firing. Glass exploding. People screaming. Children crying. Then silence. The killers did not shout commands. They did not demand money. They fired. One witness described seeing a masked man calmly reload while standing over a wounded customer. Another recalled a gunman firing into a group already lying on the floor. There was no panic in their movements, no haste, only efficiency. What shook investigators most was the absence of selectivity. The killers did not target employees. They did not focus on managers. They did not prioritize cash registers. They killed whoever was closest, whoever moved, whoever froze, sometimes whoever existed. Police began to collect testimony from survivors, but the accounts were nightmarish and inconsistent. Some described a towering figure, nicknamed later as the Giant, who moved slowly, deliberately, firing a shotgun with devastating effect. Others remembered smaller men darting through aisles, firing pistols with precision. There was confusion over numbers, over roles, over who gave orders, if anyone did. But everyone agreed on one thing. These men were not improvising. Ballistics confirmed that the same weapons were used across multiple attacks. A shotgun with distinctive markings, a handgun firing the same type of ammunition. Weapons that appeared, vanished, then reappeared months later. It suggested storage, maintenance, planning, not desperation. Belgian authorities increased police presence around supermarkets, patrol cars, uniformed guards, occasional armed response units. The killers adapted. They attacked anyway, sometimes within minutes of police patrols passing by, sometimes in towns already on edge. It was as if the killers were testing the system and learning it. The violence peaked in 1985. By then, Belgium was living in a state of low-level terror. Parents avoided shopping with children. People rushed through stores. Conversations dropped to whispers. Everyone felt watched. Then came the Delhaize attack in Aalst. It would become the most infamous event in the entire case. On November 9th, 1985, the supermarket was crowded. It was a Saturday evening. Families were buying groceries. Children waited by carts, bored and restless. The killers arrived just before closing. They did not rush. They did not hesitate. They opened fire immediately. Panic erupted. People ran. People fell. People screamed. But there was nowhere to go. The gunmen moved through the store, shooting methodically. A father shielding his family was killed. A young girl was shot while trying to flee. Customers collapsed in aisles filled with food and spilled blood. One of the most haunting details emerged later. A gunman deliberately shot a 9-year-old girl as she ran. Not by accident, not by ricochet, deliberately. 8 people were killed that night, including children. Dozens were injured. Countless lives were shattered, and the killers escaped. Again, Belgium broke. There was no longer any illusion that this was about robbery. The stolen money from Aalst amounted to a trivial sum, far less than the damage caused, far less than the lives taken. It was meaningless. The public demanded answers. Politicians demanded action. Police promised results. None came. Behind the scenes, the investigation was unraveling. Jurisdictional disputes slowed coordination. Evidence was mishandled. Leads were lost. Rival police units refused to share information. Some officers privately admitted the case had become too big, too political, too dangerous. Rumors began to circulate that suspects with powerful connections had been questioned and released, that files had gone missing, that certain names were untouchable. Nothing was proven, but the suspicion lingered. The killers seemed to sense this paralysis. After Aalst, they vanished. No final statement, no escalation, no explanation. They simply stopped. This sudden silence disturbed investigators more than the violence. Serial offenders do not stop without reason. They are arrested. They die. They escalate. They do not disappear. And yet, the Brabant Killers did. The weapons were never recovered. The perpetrators were never identified. The motive remained undefined. It was as if the terror campaign had reached its objective, but no one knew what that objective was. Years passed. Files gathered dust. Witnesses aged. Memories faded. But the wounds did not heal. Families of victims were left with questions that had no answers. Why their children? Why their parents? Why random people on ordinary nights? Why no justice? Some investigators began to believe the truth was not simply unknown, but unwanted. Because if the killers were ordinary criminals, they would have been caught. If they were extremists, they would have claimed responsibility. If they were foreign agents, there would have been traces. But if they were something closer to home, something embedded, protected, or quietly tolerated, then the silence made sense. Belgium had survived the attacks, but it had not escaped them. The fear remained, the doubt remained, and the knowledge that the killers were never punished became a national scar. By the end of 1985, the body count stood at 28 dead, 28 lives taken, dozens more broken, and no one held accountable. The Brabant Killers were no longer just a mystery. They were a failure of protection, a failure of justice, a failure of truth. And still, one question refused to fade. If these men could kill so openly, so brutally, and vanish without consequence, who were they really? After Ulst, Belgium did not demand explanations anymore. It demanded someone to blame. The pressure on investigators became suffocating. 28 dead, children among them. Entire families wiped out in public places. A nation humiliated by its inability to protect its citizens. So police turned inward, and what they found was chaos. From the beginning, the Brabant Killers investigation had been fragmented. Different police units controlled different regions. Rivalries between departments were old and bitter. Information was not centralized. Evidence passed through too many hands, and in some cases, it disappeared entirely. Files were misplaced. Weapons went missing. Witness statements contradicted earlier reports with no explanation. At first, these failures were attributed to incompetence. Later, that explanation stopped being enough. The suspect list grew long and strange. Petty criminals, former soldiers, hunters, gun collectors, political extremists, police officers, members of the gendarmerie. Names appeared, vanished, and reappeared, but no one stayed. One of the earliest suspect groups involved known criminals operating in Belgium at the time. Thieves and armed robbers with violent histories, but none matched the killers' discipline. These were men who panicked, who fled, who made mistakes. The Brabant Killers did not. Investigators then focused on ex-military personnel, the weapons handling, the formation movement, the calm under fire. It fit. But background checks yielded nothing conclusive. Too many former soldiers, too many possibilities, no proof. Then came the rumors that changed everything. Whispers within the police that some suspects could not be touched. That questioning stopped abruptly. That files were quietly reassigned, that certain leads went cold without explanation. Nothing official, nothing written, just patterns. The theory of state involvement did not begin as a conspiracy. It began as an observation. The killers operated for years without being stopped. They struck heavily policed locations. They escaped repeatedly. They vanished suddenly. That requires more than luck. Investigators began examining the possibility of far-right paramilitary groups. During the Cold War, Belgium, like many European countries, had underground networks designed to resist potential Soviet invasion. Some were secret, some were loosely supervised. Weapons existed outside normal channels. Training occurred quietly. Oversight was limited. These networks were not supposed to act domestically. But what if someone did? This line of inquiry made people nervous. Files referencing paramilitary activity were incomplete. Requests for cooperation were denied or delayed. Witnesses suddenly retracted statements. No one said stop. They didn't have to. Another suspect group emerged. Police officers themselves. Ballistics suggested access to controlled weapons, knowledge of patrol schedules, confidence around law enforcement. Several officers were questioned. Some were cleared. Some were never formally investigated. Some died under suspicious circumstances. Again, nothing conclusive. One name, however, refused to disappear. A man with a violent past. a history of firearms expertise, connections to law enforcement, a presence near multiple crime scenes. He was questioned, released, questioned again. Years later, he allegedly confessed, privately, to involvement. The confession was dismissed. No charges were filed. The suspect died without trial. As the years passed, investigators began to speak openly, but only after retirement. They described an investigation crippled not by lack of evidence, but by interference. Orders not to pursue certain leads, pressure to reclassify evidence, instructions to focus elsewhere. None of this was documented. It never is. The families of victims sensed it too. They noticed delays, contradictions, excuses that didn't make sense. They were told to be patient, to trust the process, but the process produced nothing. By the 1990s, the case had become radioactive. Too many failures, too many mistakes, too many implications. Anyone who touched it risked career damage, or worse. Journalists who attempted deep investigations reported intimidation, anonymous warnings, legal threats, access suddenly revoked. Some backed off, others persisted, and found doors closing everywhere. The idea that the Brabant Killers were just criminals no longer satisfied anyone who looked closely. Criminals want money, criminals want escape, criminals want survival. The Brabant Killers wanted something else. But what? One theory suggested destabilization, that the killings were meant to create fear, to test response times, to expose weaknesses, to justify increased security powers. If so, the killers didn't need to be caught. They needed to succeed. Another theory suggested cover for other crimes, that the violence distracted law enforcement, that resources were diverted, that other operations occurred unnoticed. Again, impossible to prove, but impossible to dismiss. What disturbed investigators most was the ending. The killers did not escalate until capture. They did not make mistakes. They did not die in shootouts. They stopped, cleanly, completely, as if told to. The statute of limitations loomed. With it came desperation. Cold cases were reopened. DNA was tested. Old witnesses were re-interviewed. But evidence decays. Memory fades. Truth becomes brittle. In 2018, Belgium officially extended the statute of limitations for the case. A symbolic gesture. Because without new evidence, time offers nothing. Today, the Brabant Killers remain officially unidentified. No arrests, no convictions, no closure. Only theories, suspicions, and silence. The most unsettling realization is not that the killers were never caught. It's that someone may have known who they were and chose not to act because the failures were too consistent, the protection too selective, the silence too complete. This transforms the case from unsolved crime into unresolved truth, and that is far more dangerous because crimes end. Truth buried by institutions does not. When the Brabant Killers stopped, Belgium did not feel relief. It felt unease, because violence usually ends with explanation, an arrest, a death, a mistake, something that allows society to close the book. But here, the book never closed. It was simply taken away. And years later, when people tried to open it again, they found pages missing. By the early 1990s, the Brabant Killers case had become a symbol of failure, not just for police, but for the state itself. Multiple investigative teams had collapsed, leads had evaporated, evidence had degraded or vanished, and yet the weight of the case refused to lessen. The bodies were buried, the grief remained active. Families of the victims continued to push, not loudly, not violently, but persistently. They asked the same questions year after year. Why were certain suspects never pursued? Why were obvious connections dismissed? Why were mistakes never acknowledged? They received no answers. Behind closed doors, however, something else was happening. Retired officers began to talk, quietly at first, then more openly. They spoke of an investigation poisoned by internal rivalry, political fear, and deliberate obstruction. Not always malicious, sometimes simply self-preserving. No one wanted responsibility for a case this big. No one wanted to be the officer who accused the wrong person, or worse, the right one. One of the most damning revelations involved evidence handling. Weapons linked ballistically to multiple crime scenes had been improperly stored. Some were destroyed, others were lost during transfers between departments. Chain of custody records were incomplete or contradictory. In any other case, this would be incompetence. Here, it felt systematic. Modern forensic experts reviewing the files decades later were stunned. Key items were missing. Original photographs had been replaced with copies. Measurements conflicted. Timelines didn't align. It was as if the case had been handled by too many hands or deliberately blurred. The rise of DNA analysis in the late 1990s briefly reignited hope. If the killers had left even a trace, skin cells, hair, blood, modern science could succeed where older methods failed. But the optimism faded quickly. Most biological evidence had degraded. Some had been contaminated. Some had been destroyed. What little remained produced no definitive matches. Then came the testimonies. Former investigators, now retired and protected by distance, described a chilling pattern. Whenever an inquiry drifted too close to certain individuals or institutions, it stalled. Files reassigned, budgets cut, personnel moved, no official order, no written command, just resistance. Journalists who pursued these threads encountered the same obstacles. Requests denied, interviews cancelled, legal warnings issued. One reporter described it as investigating a shadow that knows you're there. The idea that the Brabant Killers were protected, directly or indirectly, became harder to dismiss. Not because of a single smoking gun, but because of accumulation. Too many coincidences, too many interruptions, too many dead ends that felt engineered. One particularly disturbing aspect was the lack of motive clarity. Decades later, investigators still could not agree on why the killings happened. Robbery didn't fit. Terrorism didn't fit. Ideology didn't fit. The violence was extreme but directionless, which led to a troubling possibility. The violence itself may have been the goal. Some theorists suggested the attack served as a stress test of police response, emergency coordination, public reaction. The killers struck different locations at different times under different conditions. They learned, they adapted, they disappeared. This is not how criminals behave. It is how planners behave. Others pointed to the Cold War context. Belgium sat at a crossroads of European politics and military infrastructure. Secret networks existed. Weapons caches existed. People trained for extreme scenarios existed. If those structures fractured, even briefly, the consequences could be catastrophic and inconvenient to expose. Still, no document ever surfaced to confirm this. No confession, no directive, no undeniable proof, only implication. In 2010, renewed public pressure forced authorities to reopen parts of the investigation. Cold case units reviewed thousands of pages. Witnesses were re-interviewed, old suspects re-examined. And yet, the same barriers appeared, the same missing links, the same unanswered questions. Perhaps the most haunting detail is that some investigators no longer believe the truth is discoverable. Not because it never existed, but because it was dismantled, piece by piece, decision by decision, silence by silence. The case was extended legally, statutes of limitation pushed back, as if time itself could be negotiated. But time offers no evidence, only erosion. Today, the Brabant Killers remain officially unidentified, but unofficially, they are something else entirely. They are a mirror, reflecting what happens when institutions prioritize stability over truth, when fear of consequence outweighs justice, when silence becomes policy. Belgium still remembers. Every anniversary, every documentary, every reopened wound. The victims' names are spoken, the images replayed, the questions asked again, and every time the answers fail to appear, which leads to the most unsettling realization of all. This case does not feel unsolved. It feels unfinished, as if the final chapter was never meant to be written. Belgium, decades after the last attack, remained haunted. It was a nation that had survived war, revolution, and occupation, yet nothing in its history had prepared it for the slow, creeping terror of the Brabant Killers. 28 dead, dozens injured, public spaces transformed into stages for horror. And all for what? The question itself seemed to taunt every citizen. What was the purpose of this violence, and who allowed it to continue? By the late 1990s, the country had changed. CCTV was more common. Investigative methods improved. DNA technology arrived. Police departments consolidated. Cold case units reopened files. They searched storage rooms for missing documents. They interviewed witnesses who had long ago tried to forget. They reviewed every scrap of evidence, every ballistics report, every statement once dismissed as irrelevant. And still, nothing conclusive emerged. Some investigators began to whisper a terrifying thought aloud. Perhaps the Brabant Killers were never meant to be caught. Not because the evidence was insufficient, not because the suspects were clever, but because someone in power had deliberately ensured the chaos continued. Every mismanaged file, every missing weapon, every witness ignored, every lead killed in committee. These were not accidents. They formed a pattern, one that seemed to suggest oversight. Intentional, invisible, untouchable. Among the most shocking revelations were the alleged political connections of certain suspects. Former soldiers, members of paramilitary units, police officers with deep ties to local officials. Names kept surfacing in private memos, never publicly acknowledged. Suspects who should have been investigated to the fullest were quietly released. Threats were made, letters sent, warnings issued, and then silence. No one could explain why, but the pattern repeated with such precision that even skeptics began to acknowledge a disturbing possibility. The Brabant Killers were being protected, or at least tolerated, by elements of the state. At the same time, forensic breakthroughs offered hope. Advanced ballistics allowed investigators to re-examine shell casings with microscopic precision. DNA from clothing fragments and hair samples was sent to labs capable of detecting even the smallest matches. Witness accounts were digitized, cross-referenced, and re-analyzed for inconsistencies. And yet, the killers remained invisible. The guns remained unidentified. The motive remained elusive. Every scientific advance confirmed only one terrifying truth. The killers had anticipated scrutiny. They had prepared. They had vanished from every angle. Some theorists argued that the Brabant Killers were not ordinary criminals, not in the sense of seeking money, revenge, or recognition. The pattern of their attacks suggested training, discipline, and strategic thinking. The killers studied human behavior, observed law enforcement patterns, and executed every attack with meticulous timing. They had created terror, not for profit, but for effect. A social experiment, a test, or perhaps a statement. But whose statement? That question remained unanswered. Journalists continued to probe the case, often at great personal risk. Investigations were met with bureaucratic roadblocks. Files went missing. Phone calls were monitored or traced. Anonymous threats were issued. Some reporters abandoned their research. Others doubled down, convinced that the case represented a dark undercurrent in Belgian society that authorities wanted buried. Every revelation came with a warning. Dig too deeply, and you might disappear from history just like those files. International investigators eventually became involved, comparing the Brabant Killers to other unsolved mass attacks across Europe. Patterns emerged. Indiscriminate killings in public spaces, use of military-style weapons, apparent lack of motive, and a methodical approach to avoiding capture. Some believed the case was part of a larger European pattern of politically motivated terror, though concrete connections could never be proven. Belgium became the epicenter of a network of shadows that may have stretched beyond its borders. But again, proof was elusive. Psychologists who studied the surviving evidence noted something extraordinary. The killer's behavior suggested intentional escalation and restraint simultaneously. They struck with lethal violence, yet avoided situations where capture was certain. They terrorized communities without drawing overwhelming attention to themselves. They were controlled, calculated, and frighteningly rational. The public interpreted this differently. To them, it was madness. To investigators, it was almost terrifyingly intelligent. The victims' families continued their pursuit of justice, undeterred by decades of frustration. They lobbied politicians, demanded reopening of cold cases, and refused to let memory fade. Some succeeded in obtaining small concessions, renewed investigations, media coverage, access to archived files. But justice remained elusive. The killers were untouchable, either because of planning, protection, or both. One chilling detail haunted everyone. No insider ever came forward. No whistleblower revealed the identities or the motives of the killers. Even retired officers who spoke quietly acknowledged that revealing too much could endanger lives. The implication was clear. Someone powerful had ensured the silence endured. Theories proliferated. Some suggested foreign espionage, that Belgium had become a testing ground for covert operations, and the attacks were intended to destabilize society. Others speculated internal political violence, possibly orchestrated by rogue paramilitary factions. Still others pointed to organized crime networks, using terror as leverage. All theories were plausible. All theories were unprovable. And that impossibility became the most terrifying element of all. The case was not just unsolved. It was deliberately unsolvable. Modern investigators began to reflect on the psychological and societal impact. Cities became cautious. Commerce slowed in areas of previous attacks. Parents kept children closer to home. And supermarkets installed elaborate security measures. The Brabant Killers had left more than death behind. They left a permanent state of fear, a psychological footprint that could not be erased, and a lesson in human vulnerability. Even today, decades later, the case continues to fascinate true crime communities worldwide. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports dissect every known detail, speculating endlessly about the killers' identities, motives, and connections. The case has become mythic in scope, part crime story, part political thriller, part horror narrative. But the central question remains: who were the Brabant Killers? And why were they allowed to succeed? Perhaps the most unsettling conclusion is the simplest. They succeeded completely. They killed 28 people. They injured dozens more. They terrorized a nation, and they vanished without capture or explanation. They demonstrated that fear can be manufactured systematically, that violence can be used strategically, and that human institutions are vulnerable to manipulation, corruption, and failure. In some ways, the Brabant Killers were not criminals in the conventional sense. They were architects of terror, sculpting chaos with precision. And the most horrifying thought of all is that the world may never know the full scope of their intentions or who protected them. The Belgian landscape today shows no visible scars from the killings. Supermarkets operate normally. Streets are quiet. Children play in parks. But the memory persists, embedded in the collective consciousness. For investigators, journalists, and historians, the case serves as a reminder. Sometimes, the absence of truth is more frightening than the presence of violence. The Brabant Killers, whoever they were, remain ghosts. Not because they were clever, not because they fled, not because they were unknown. They remain ghosts because the world that could have stopped them chose not to act. And in that choice, the most terrifying lesson endures. The dead may be gone, but the system that allowed it lives on. The story of the Brabant Killers ends not with resolution, but with reflection. The names of the victims, the terror inflicted, and the questions that will never be answered remain a monument to human vulnerability, institutional failure, and calculated, unpunished violence. This is why, even decades later, the Brabant Killers are remembered, not for what they stole or what they destroyed, but for what they revealed about fear itself and the powerlessness of those who should have stopped it. The case is closed in files, but open in memory. It is unsolved. It is unresolved. It is, perhaps, unsolvable.